Bien, nous allons reprendre avec Lisa Giombini, qui est professeure assistante en esthétique à l'université de Roma et Visiting Research Fellow à l'université d'Hertfordshire au Royaume-Uni. Ses recherches portent principalement sur la philosophie de la musique, ainsi que sur les enjeux éthiques et esthétiques de la conservation, restauration. Elle est l'auteure de 2 monographies, Musical Ontology, A Guide for the Perplexed, et Artworks and Their Conservation. Et son exposé s'intitule Provenential Properties, Style and the Aesthetic Value of History.
Thank you. Merci, donc je suis vraiment très contente d'être ici et je suis désolée mais je vais parler en anglais parce que c'est en fait la langue dans laquelle je travaille toujours, donc c'est plus facile pour moi. Mais sinon, voilà, si vous voulez, après je peux répondre, j'espère, en français. I will try at least because I'm kind of confused in between these languages. So, thank you very much. So my paper is titled Provenential Properties. This is maybe an unknown word for you. I will explain what it means. Style and aesthetic value of history. So let's start from a very basic consideration. So art history tells us many fascinating things about the artworks we cherish and their history of making. So for example, from Renaissance art books, we discover that the large block of marble that Michelangelo transformed into the very famous sculpture, the David, had actually been abandoned by the previous 2 artists who were commissioned to use it. This marble slab remained untouched for 25 years until Michelangelo began work on it in 1501 and transformed it into the very everlasting masterpiece we all know. Another example, scholars who have scrutinized canvases with X-ray technology tell us that many paintings, including, for example, Raphael's or Raffaello portraits of a young woman with a unicorn, have undergone several heavy retouchings and restorations throughout their history and appear today substantially different from what they did in the past. Pentimenti by the original artist are also very common and concern famous works like Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, over there, or Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini's portrait. Of course, you know all of them. And if we turn to other arts, we learn from music historians that many renowned pieces we believe to be the work of a certain composer are instead later forgeries. These include Mozart's Adelaide's Concerto, which in fact was a spurious work by Marius Casadeus, and the famous Albinoni Adagio in G minor, which in spite of its name was actually written by Remo Giazzotto in 1958. So these and other similar examples, I think, provide compelling evidence of one element that most of us find essential when we relate to art, namely, the significance of knowing facts about artwork's history. People are willing to crowd into museums for hours in order to partake in guided tours and learn stories about the works and their creators, or alternatively, they eagerly search for such pieces of information in travel books and brochures. So it's not enough for them to simply walk around museums and art cities and look at the works in front of them, even when these are unquestionably beautiful and popular. So why is art history so valuable to us? Does this knowledge, which is clearly of concern to the art historian, also have some bearing on the aesthetic appreciation and evaluation of artworks? So a variety of answers can be given to this question. As a matter of fact, in spite of the relevance accorded to history by critics, curators, and audiences, there is considerable disagreement among philosophers about history's aesthetic value. One could argue that a work's history of provenance might make no difference to its aesthetic appreciation. If a work of art satisfies us, if it pleases our eyes or ears, then it should be aesthetically relevant who created it and when. Arguments of this kind involve the claim that historical and contextual factors are not of aesthetic interest, although obviously they may be important for biographical, historical, psychological, or sociological reasons. So my suggestion in this paper is that this debate, so the debate over the aesthetic value of history, can be fundamentally reframed as a dispute over what kind of properties are legitimately involved in our aesthetic appreciation of art. Are the context-dependent properties of a work of art, so those reliant on its history, to be considered aesthetic properties in the proper sense of the term? Can they represent a direct source of aesthetic appreciation? Of course, at least part of the answer to this question rests on what we take the term aesthetic to mean. This paper does not really address this issue directly, though I'm not brave enough to do that, because I'm more interested in discussing particular examples of properties than in making a generalization about the class as a whole. As it suggests, I will proceed by questioning which properties of an artwork may be considered aesthetically relevant and, if this holds for some, but not all such properties, how we can make this distinction. So while some properties have obvious aesthetic relevance, in that they are the very properties we attend to in our encounters with artworks, others do not, or not so directly. These are the properties of a work that are related to its provenance and history of making. So drawing on a Goodmanian notion of style as a simple system of some sort, I will try to argue that stylistic properties are able to bring history to the aesthetic frame by somehow exemplifying the contextual meaning that they convey. So in this sense, I would claim historical knowledge can be made somewhat aesthetically relevant. So as you see, the paper has 4 main parts. This was the introduction, and the purpose of section 2 is to get clear on what I shall call the manifest and the provincial properties of a work. In section 3, I will discuss some standard answers to the philosophical literature to the question of the aesthetic values of art to history, so formalism, empiricism, contextualism, and then I will move to discuss style. So let's move on to part 2. Okay. So you know that philosophers have long reflected on the role played in art appreciation by that set of contextually dependent properties, historical, contextual, relational, that relate a work to its author, its origins, including the artistic intentions, the expectations, the artistic tradition, and intellectual atmosphere of the society. So drawing on a notion coming from David Davis and 2 papers of him from 2009 and 2010, I shall term such properties provenential properties, and I will distinguish them from what I shall call the manifest aesthetic properties of a work of art. So by manifest aesthetic properties, I mean the aesthetic properties of a work traditionally understood, so those that usually appear in our aesthetic judgment or aesthetic descriptions. Properties such as unified, balanced, integrated, serene, powerful, delicate, and all the examples that we have been hearing throughout this conference. These are some of Sibley's examples. So manifest properties are manifested to a viewer in the immediate perceptual encounter with the object or event that is the artwork, as when we look at a painting or listen to a piece of music. So although these properties are not to be found in works in the same straightforward way as other non-aesthetic features, such as colors or shapes or pitches, we nonetheless perceive them directly. For example, we can see the dynamism of a painting, like this one by Turner, or we can hear the serenity of a sonata, even if this may require some special training or sensitivity or taste, as has been said on our part. So for the sake of the argument, I shall leave aside the question of whether manifest properties are reducible to non-aesthetic ones, whether they merge, whether they supervene on the latter, which have been discussed enough during this conference. So as such, manifest properties represent what we may call a direct source of aesthetic appreciation, in that they experientially affect the appreciation of the work that possess such properties. Provenential properties, on the other hand, are properties that express the work's history of making, displaying the specific historical or intentional relation that links an artwork to its provenance. Examples include properties that comprise both relational features of an artwork history, so as David says, when and where the artist's activity took place, what other activities preceded it, and so on. Properties like being a 19th century style, being a Baroque painting, being a forerunner for its time, and so on. And also, more specifically and generally non-relational features such as being from Caravaggio's hand, being composed by Haydn, so properties that tells us who performed the activity, what materials were employed, what specific action made up this activity, and so on. So provenential properties are related to the original artist's creative activity, which resulted in a work having the kinds of manifest properties that we recognize it to have. Being tied to the artwork history, sorry, we're always here, provenential properties are also responsible for the object's authenticity, because determining an artwork's authenticity is equal to determining the properties testifying to how the work came to be, its link to the original context of production, the creator's intention, and so on. And relatedly, for works in all artistic media, provenential properties are the class of properties that render a specific artwork a unique work of art. So a certain painting may have the same manifest properties of its perfectly indistinguishable copy, for example, being lively, balanced, dynamic, and so on, or of a product of Gregory Scarry supercopier, which was mentioned by Alexandre yesterday, so a machine able to produce molecule by molecule duplicates of any work. And nevertheless, by virtue of its possession of certain provenential properties, it still counts as a unique work of art. So a very natural assumption, so to say, which we shall have to question here, is that provenential properties, unlike manifest properties, have no direct aesthetic value, since they presumably imply contextual information to be recognized, perceived, or appreciated. So this means that we cannot grasp them, just as we grasp that a certain piece of music is melancholic or serene, a painting grotesque, dynamic, and so on. For it seems a sonata does not have to be serene in virtue of what its composer's society happened to be at the time. But this raises the question, are provenential properties aesthetic properties? Can they bear upon our aesthetic appreciation of a work, just as much as we believe manifest aesthetic properties do? So these questions also foreground the more general and much thornier issue of what principal line we can draw between questions about the artwork's aesthetics and questions about their histories. We move on to part 2. So those who want to make this line between aesthetics and history quite sharp regard the distinction in the wake of what is classically known as formalism, or in later philosophical debates as aesthetic empiricism. So broadly speaking, formalism can be seen as a view of the kind of properties of a work of art that determine its correct aesthetic appreciation. More specifically, formalism implies that all aesthetically relevant properties of an artwork are merely formal, where formal means that they are typically regarded as properties of a work's surface, graspable by sight or by hearing. So while hints of this idea go back at least as far as Kant's pure aesthetic judgment, formalism is normally traced back to approaches of the late 19th, 20th century. You know that critics such as Clive Bear, Roger Fry, but also more recently philosophers such as Nick Zangwill. So the formalist claim is generally taken to follow from both the so-called immediacy and the so-called disinterest thesis. So the immediacy thesis implies that the aesthetic relevance of the properties whose grasping requires the use of knowledge. The disinterest thesis, on the other hand, implies the aesthetic irrelevance of all properties that are capable of practical import. If you take these theses together, what happens is that you are forced to say that aesthetic appreciation depends solely on a work's of art's visual, auditory, or otherwise sensual appearance. A position analogous to formalism is so-called aesthetic empiricism, a term that, as you know, was coined by Gregory Cares in 1980. So compared to formalism, empiricism places more stress on how the aesthetic properties of a work are to be retrieved in order to be aesthetics, rather than on the specific kind of nature. So Cares' formulation of aesthetic empiricism goes as follows. It says, for an aesthetic empiricist, what is aesthetically valuable in a painting can be directly detected merely by looking at it. So features that cannot be so detected are not properly aesthetic ones. This is extended to other arts, including other sense modalities, for example, hearing for music or verbal understanding for literature. Aesthetic empiricists claim that properties of a work that cannot be perceptually detected, so properties related to the work's provenance, are not aesthetic, and thus cannot ideally bear upon aesthetic appreciation. So to properly appreciate a work of art, we should confine ourselves to direct scrutiny of the work, whether looking at it, listening to it, reading off its manifold features. And a consequence of these ideas, you might guess, at least in its more radical version, is that the history of a work, which is expressed by its provenential properties, has no aesthetic value per se. Although there are some exceptions, it has become increasingly common to argue that formalism and aesthetic empiricism are wrong. This is partly because facts about the history of making of an artwork seem to be crucially important in practice and from a number of different points of view. So people who hold such a view include, for example, those who want to defend a cognitivist account of art, those who worry that the formalist view cannot give a reliable account of the values we find in art, and those who fear that it misread the variety of ways in which we engage with artworks, as is evident in the practice of critics and audiences. But in philosophy, as you know, the main argument against formalism or empiricism derives from Dante's famous argument from indiscernibles. Inspired by Warhol's Brillo boxes, Dante observed that form alone neither makes an artwork nor gives it the meaning it has. So in this view, what we value in a work of art includes much more than what our eyes or ears can grasp. This position can be generally referred to, or has been generally referred to, as contextualism. Art requires the identification of a relevant context to be brought to focus, including the circumstances under which a work was produced, the type of procedures involved, and so on. So from a contextualist perspective, artworks are, as Levinson says, historically embedded objects. They are historical individuals that are the product of a particular individual's invention at a particular time and place. So as such, they can have neither art status, identity, aesthetic properties, nor meaning outside or apart the context in which they have arisen and are produced. So today I want to discuss these two approaches. While contextualism clearly implies a positive answer to the question from which we started, so whether history can have aesthetic value. A worry about this position, I think, is that it does not really explain why it is so. So this is assumed to be the case because of the way works of art are as historically embedded objects. Nevertheless, if you think about it, many objects, and in fact all human-made artifacts, are historically embedded. But we do not always include facts about their origins in the way we appraise them, nor do we deem the history of making essential to their appreciation. For instance, we evaluate a stick knife for its ability to cut meat, regardless who made it or where. We appreciate parquet flooring or wooden furniture for their smoothness or the warm quality that they convey to a space without scrutinizing their origins, or we praise the quality of a garment without necessarily knowing its designer. So why is the art case different from these other cases? What is so special about art that makes historical and contextual factors central elements for its appreciation and experience? On the other hand, if you turn to the formalist empiricist view, well, although it's true that this view, so the view that art should be judged simply by what can be immediately perceived, is untenable and plainly at odds with cases such as literature and conceptual art. This does not imply that we have to get rid completely of the idea that there must be some connection between aesthetic value and perception. In other words, I think we may still hold firm to the importance of direct perceiving in aesthetics, to the claim that the aesthetic value of a work must reside in some way and be accessible to some appreciative experience or perception of a work. So I will draw on Peter Lamar here to call this idea, so the idea that there is no aesthetic difference without an experiential difference, and no experiential difference without a difference in our discriminatory response and moderate empiricist constraint. So in this approach, a property is aesthetics if the subject can perceptually discern cases in which the property is present from cases where the property is not present, which clearly is not the same as claiming that all knowledge is irrelevant to aesthetic appreciation, as the formalists would like to say. My concern in the present paper, however, is not to provide a straightforward argument in support of this claim, and neither am I to offer a critique of contextualism or reiterate well-known objections against formalism once again. Rather, what I'm interested in is looking at the status of provenential properties once both radical formalism and contextualism are ruled out. So this should allow me to provide at least some indirect support for the moderate form of empiricism I am endorsing here. So suppose we say that the property of a work of art has aesthetic value if it makes a difference to the recipient's direct engagement with the artwork. Then we might insist that the provincial properties of a work have aesthetic value only if they are proved to have experiential value, so if they are somehow directly discernible in our engagement with the work that bears upon its proper appreciation. So the claim that I want to make here is that at least some provenential properties of a work do that, so they work exactly in this way. This, I contend, concerns those provenential properties that are relational, so the first type we discussed, and particularly those that are related to an artwork style. So we move on to part 4, which is style and stylistic properties. So broadly understood, style can be taken as the distinctive visual appearance of an object, which is determined by the creative principle, inspiration, and taste according to which something is designed. This is a very famous definition by Gombrich. So although style can pertain to objects and actions that do not belong to the artistic realm, we can say, for example, that a certain kitchen tool has a futuristic style, a person has an authoritarian style. But style has primary importance in the arts and has a bearing on many aesthetic debates about creativity, aesthetic qualities, and the status of artistic objects. One important distinction concerning the notion of style was famously put forward by Richard Wollheim, who identified two senses in which the concept of style can occur. So we can talk of individual style to refer to the style of a singular artist, say the style of Giotto, and we can talk of general style to refer to the style of a period of time, Gothic art. So according to Wollheim, individual style is primarily an outcome of the psychomotor character of individual artists. So a feature of the artist's psychology that plays a guiding role in her artistic activity, giving her works, or some of her works, their artistic character. This feature in turn depends on a number of things, the artist's experience, her knowledge of art history, her ability to creatively imagine ways of doing things, and so on. General style, on the other hand, represents some sort of common denominator in the production of a time, something that is external to the singular individual and not a function of their own activities as artists. So general style is associated with a set of distinctive properties that group artworks together or set them apart in being innovative, striking, or important. This explains why, according to Volem, there are several forms of general style, including school style, period style, cultural style, and so on. So if we take Baroque, you have an example here of a Baroque church in Rome. So Baroque is a general period style, and we can point to various characteristics of Baroque art, like florid ornamentation, lively movement, asymmetrical patterns that are stylistic properties of such works. What is more relevant to my aim here, however, is that stylistic properties, either of an individual or a general type, are provenential properties in the proper sense of the term, in that they are context-dependent properties that relate a work to its author, provenance, and original context, testifying to the work's history of making. So for this reason, as it's been emphasized by Nelson Goodman in two famous papers, stylistic properties do play a key role in the process of identifying an artwork and are integral to its correct authentication. So according to Goodman, recognizing a style allows us to attribute an artwork to one artist, one period, one region, and so on. Style serves, Goodman says, as an individual or group signature, answering questions such as who made the work, when, and where, and helping us to place the work in the appropriate context. In the literature, this idea is known as the signature view of style. Style is conceived therein as having something to do with what is characteristic of an individual artist or a region, period, school, genre, in a somewhat autographic way, much like a signature. So why I think this idea points in the right direction, a central aspect that the signature view tends to overlook is that style is more than a mere tool or device for identifying and cataloging the variety of works and approaches that characterize the art of the past. For style represents in itself the intentional focus of our aesthetic appreciation. Stylistic properties indeed transpose the psychological, historical, cultural character of an artist or period into the artwork's perceptual features by translating an abstract content, this abstract character, into shapes, pictures, colors, rhythms. In doing that, it seems that style works somehow much like a symbol system of some sort, as has been suggested by Genova, 1979. If we unpack symbolic here, using Goodman's classification of the modes of symbolization, then we might say that stylistic properties express or exemplify metaphorically a certain content through form, in a way that makes such content manifest and perceivable to us. I'm not entering into technicalities here, but 2 points are essential for this notion of style and the way for Goodman's notion of style and expression and the way I apply it. So first of all, as renown, according to Goodman, expression is a mode of reference that is not to be mistaken with the manifestation of an artist's feelings or emotion awakened in the recipient. Expression is rather a form of metaphorical exemplification, where exemplification is possession plus reference to a label. For example, a green color sample both has and refers to the property labeled green. So we say that it exemplifies green. In the case of expression, the properties exemplified by the symbol are acquired metaphorically. So, for example, we can say that an environmentally friendly building that is also painted in green metaphorically exemplifies being green. So here you can see a building that was lighted in green to testify that the restoration was environmental friendly. Okay, so they decided that the green light would symbolize that. So now the interesting thing about style is that stylistic properties seem to be able to metaphorically exemplify, in the sense described by Goodman, predicates that describe what the work is about, its cultural and historical meaning. So in other words, they both have and refer to the labels we use to describe the work. So style weds form to content, and content, and transposes the imperceptible properties of a work, its culture and social meaning, into perceptible features, one that can be said to experientially bear upon the work's aesthetic appreciation. Style is thus tied to history, as well as to the aesthetic impact of an object. So if we want to paraphrase Dante, we can say that style brings artwork's history to their surfaces. While being context-related provenential properties, stylistic properties, however, are also perceptually discernible and can be detected in direct experiential engagements with the work. We can say that is determine whether a work belongs to a style merely by perceiving it. So to the same extent, we can see or hear whether it does not. For example, we can recognize Karajan's style, while directing, conducting style, and differentiate it from Muti's simply because of how it sounds, provided, of course, that we are sufficiently familiar with the styles of both. To the same extent, we are able to distinguish and discern the Impressionist style from the Fauvist style just by how it looks, if we know enough about them. So let me recap. So far I've claimed that style represents a device by which the provenential properties of an artwork may manifest themselves in our experiential encounter with such work. Attributing an artwork to the right style is thus not only crucial for the object's identification as a unique work of art, but also for its aesthetic appreciation. Importantly, I'm not simply claiming here that stylistic properties are useful aids to aesthetic judgment or that they provide us with hints concerning the aesthetic content of a work. Rather, I'm trying to suggest that they impact the quality of aesthetic appreciation altogether by determining also what manifest aesthetic properties an artwork has. In other words, my contention is that in many cases, a work of art can be properly regarded as melancholic, serene, elegant, whatever, only once it is correctly interpreted as a work in a certain style. I know this may sound a bold claim, but it's quite easy to motivate, at least in a superficial way. You can think of contemporary examples. Maybe you know the punk band, the Ramones. So if you listen to the Ramones at rockabilly, okay, many of their songs may sound violent and wild to us. If, on the other hand, you listen to them as, say, an early punk band, they sound much quieter, rowdy but kind of catchier and pop, so to say. And if you judge them as punk rock, they are somewhere in the middle. So similarly, the claim that a painting is dynamic really amounts to the claim that it's dynamic once seen as an instance of a style. I think there are many kind of similar examples that we can make. So if I'm right here, this implies that the manifest aesthetic properties of a work materialize when the work is perceived under a certain style. Stylistic properties thus determine most of the manifest aesthetic properties a work has, given that which one it seems to have depends on what style it is perceived to have. We can debate the philosophical implication of these, but I suspect that this idea doesn't sound too far-fetched when viewed in light of Kendall Walton's, what he argues about artistic categories. So that's the framework. So before concluding, let me emphasize one further important aspect. The fact that stylistic features, as I said, can be perceptually discernible does not imply that it can be easily or immediately discerned. Styles are in fact very difficult to identify without learning. Recognizing a work as a work in a certain style is a skill that must be acquired by constant training, forming the eye and ear to discriminate significant stylistic properties. For example, If no one has ever explained to me what is distinctive about the Baroque style in architecture, as opposed to Gothic, neoclassicism, and so on, by flagging to its distinctive properties, or even pointed out that there is something else, the Baroque style, I may never recognize Baroque style, even if I've been exposed to several Baroque buildings or churches or paintings in my life. I may not see such buildings as Baroque, simply. The same goes for individual styles. If I know nothing about the style of Brahms, having never consciously listened to any of his work, I will not be able to identify it as such. So what is important is that to learn a style, pure knowledge or pure contextual information is not sufficient. We must learn how to grasp this information by directly experiencing a work and judge it at a work in that style by what we then perceive in it. Historical facts and other information may be helpful to determine whether a painting is, say, fauve, for example, the time of place and fabrication, facts about the author, the biography, and so on. But we must learn to see the painting as fauve to understand why this style is truly attributable to the work. To the same extent, it is of no use to just immersing oneself in one particular artwork in a certain style, even with the knowledge that of what style it belongs to. For that alone will not enable us to perceive it as a work in a certain style. We must train our perceptive skill and see that style as it exemplified in the work. So exposure to many great works, having a style in question is an essential part of this training because it offers an unlimited pool of knowledge to improve our perceptive discrimination skills. So our perception is strengthened or refined by testing against further cases. Many artistic features indeed appear only when we juxtapose works in comparison. So familiarity provides us with the capacity for generalization and differentiation. And the greater the view familiarity with works in a style, the finer our capacity to recognize its relevant feature. So for a naive viewer, Cimabue's painting, like this one, My Study Assisi, for example, is just a depiction of a Madonna with the child Jesus. For an experienced viewer, it reveals a different meaning. She can classify the painting as a Gothic masterpiece with specific iconographic features. She might notice the tapered hand shape, which is typical of middle-aged Tuscan pictorial style, or observe the thrones and chairs depicted frontally with both sides open like pages, as is usual in pre-perspective paintings. To understand and appreciate all the stylistic features, the viewer needs to be acquainted with many other works in that particular style and the symbolic code it entails. So once the concept of an artistic style is learned, the viewer can classify new examples by acknowledging similarities and differences with known works, so that with increasing style expertise, appreciation shifts from a mere description of what is depicted to a classification in terms of complex style-specific properties. So to conclude, in this paper I try to argue that stylistic properties, as a subset of provenential properties, metaphorically exemplify aspects of the work that is related to its origins and context of production. Being directly, yet not completely immediately discernible in experiential encounters with an artwork, stylistic properties are capable of making facts about the history of a work aesthetically valuable. Moreover, I've tried to claim that stylistic property can help determine what the manifest aesthetic property of the work are, since the latter depend at least in part, at least in some relevant artistic cases, on the identification of the former. This pushes us toward giving a positive answer to the question of the aesthetic relevance of at least some provenential properties, namely stylistic properties. So the underlying assumption here is that for a property to be aesthetically relevant, it must be discernible perceptually. So it must, in the sense that it must make some difference to how we experience the artwork in arriving at a proper appreciation of the work. While what matters aesthetically about a painting or a sonata cannot simply be thought as depending on how it looks or sounds, there is something right, I think, in the idea that aesthetic differences arise between works at the point where perceptual differences emerge. The aesthetic value of a work is thus tied in some way, yet not straightforwardly, to our experiential engagement with the product of the artistic activity. So although in this paper I admittedly have not offered any direct justification for this claim, I hope the case presented has been convincing enough to show at least its plausibility. Thank you very much for your attention.